You're lighter now, Akaza stated, carrying me for what felt like the millionth time now. At least, this time it was normal. I wasn't being tossed over his shoulder like a bag of junk. I peered up at him through a cynical raised brow. He didn't look at me as he said those words. His eyes were only ahead of us, always focused, always aware of everything and anything that could happen. What do you mean, lighter? I inquired, not entirely sure what he would have meant by that. He paused for a moment before replying. Your weight. He then commented, casting a single downwards glance towards me. You've gone lighter since the last time I had carried you. I opened my mouth to respond, but honestly couldn't think of anything to say. I only stared upwards, watching his eyes scanning the forest while we made our way to the city. Well, you insisted on carrying me, I pointed out. His lips turned upwards in a small bit. Because you're slow, and we would have made it in time otherwise. His smile was still up, only increasing with every word. Didn't we discuss this already? I scrunched my face up into a frown, looking away from him. Yeah, I know. I sighed, closing my eyes for a moment. I still don't understand why we have to be there before the sun rises anyway. Well, that wasn't entirely true. I had a good inkling, somewhat of a theory that I had formed over the last few weeks with him. In truth, I was just impatient and only wanted more information about what the hell was going to happen next. Yes, you do, he said, shaking his head. I peered up at him from under my lashes. The sky was beginning to lighten even as we spoke, and in the last 10 minutes or so, Akaza had sped up his pace in the slightest bit. You just wanted to be sure. You demons aren't capable of being out in the sun, I stated, not entirely a question. What? Do you just die immediately? He laughed, his violent voice so at odds with his demon intelligence. Something like that was all he gives in return. I glanced. I thought I was promised answers. Another peek down at me, tearing his eyes off, and clearing again. You were, but I just said I would once we arrived, which in your case we haven't we? I scoffed, feeling as though I wasn't going anywhere in this verbal battle with him. Fine, but I don't have the infinite amount of patience that you do. I know, he said simply, focusing back on what was ahead of us. Staring up at him, I honestly couldn't believe myself for having spent weeks with him, not only to ask him hardly anything at all. Embarrassment bloomed inside me, and I had to look away and towards the ground. I'd been a complete and utter idiot, seizing the opportunity to get stronger with one of the strongest. Now, was that all I cared about? Why hadn't I questioned more about him and other demons in general, as well as what he wanted with me? In my professional years of training and missions, I've never been so blind before. All I'd been thinking of was my sister, the fear of failing her, and this opportunity taking a hold of me more strongly than anything. I was ashamed, and now I realized it. I was swarming with questions. My mind had held them in the very back for so long, but now they've completely come through, screaming at me to ask the demon. But I reluctantly bit my tongue, trying to summon any amount of patience I could. You think I lost weight? I asked, after a few minutes of silence, knowing it was irritating me. It was one thing I knew he could answer, or at least explain. The tattooed demon grunted in agreement. I can tell, he began, shifting me in his arms in emphasis. You worked yourself too hard in the hopes of gaining strength, but with more and more training, you didn't allow yourself to properly rest, nor did you keep yourself fed enough. He glanced down at me in what seemed like the oddest set of emotions, something along the lines of annoyance, but also another one I couldn't place properly. In fact, working so hard without taking care of your body was what probably made you exactly weaker in some points. I tried not to flinch at the emphasis on the word. I figured you'd lean suspicious before, but I left most of it towards you, expecting you to be capable of handling it. This time, I really did flinch, feeling my body cringe inwardly at itself from the way I had been acting. We both were silent for what felt a few more minutes, and I let out a deep breath. I know. It was irritational, but I can tell that you're aware of it, so I won't lecture you too badly. But I hope you're aware of your mistake now, Yin. He looked at me, and I stared into his eyes. You always catch me by surprise, more often than not, demon. And Akaza's brows scrunched together. I do? He sounded gently confused. I nod, smiling slightly before breaking our eye contact. You aren't like most others. I breathed, flashing of the other encounters with the beast coming through. Beast. That's right. That's what they all had been, each and every one of those demons. And in the large mixture of them, I included myself in that group as well. I had been just as bad as a rogue demon. But Akaza? He halted his walking, almost a little shocked at what I had been saying, before shaking his head and picking up his pace again. I'm not human, Yin. Of course I'm different. I shake my head. I know, but you're also different from both demons and humans alike. You are just different in general. Something flashed in his eyes, and his steady speed quickened again. I could hear the sounds of voices and music, and figured we had made it close, quite close now. Perfect timing, I endorsed, from looking at the lightning sky. I don't know what you mean by that, he finally said, snapping me back to the present once again. I laughed softly, and again his eyes faltered to the sound. I know, I'll explain it soon, I started, grinning, once you answer my questions first. He didn't answer right away, but after a few seconds, fine. The upper moon demon didn't have a clue what he was doing, but he was put effort into making it appear like he did for the young assassin. In all honesty, his actions tonight took even himself by surprise. After their argument, he never expected to just let her leave. Sure, he'd been mad. In fact, he couldn't remember the last time he'd ever been so frustrated at a single human. Though, of course, she wasn't like most. A fact she always kept reminding me of with the way she was. He'd ask over and over again why she kept ruining herself, and he didn't know why it had bothered him, why something knotted inside his stomach every time he'd seen her looking as though she were on the brink of death each day. It was preposterous at him, like a thought that wouldn't cease to leave his mind. Strength. It was the most important to him and to the woman in his arms as well. But Akaza himself had been so shocked, so irritable by her resolve. It was what had drawn him in the first. But seeing her going to such lengths, he's never seen anything like it. Never in the centuries of living. And at first, he wasn't going to let her simply leave and abandon their deal. Technically, he wasn't allowed to. He had a mission, an assignment that required her. But then, she'd snap. And something almost about those words, the last one Yin had screamed at him, made every thought drain out of him completely. It had struck him utterly frozen, incapable of anything, her words of such a devastation becoming everything in that moment. Akaza supposed that maybe that was why he wanted to save her. Because once that shock had worn off, he had questions himself, and they both assumed each other held the answers for each one. That couldn't have been the only reason he'd gone for her, but as of right now, it was a logical explanation as to why he had acted in such a stolid manner, shocking both of them. Yin stayed more or less silent for the last few minutes of the way there. Either she was bored with that useless attention span of hers, or she was just tired. Akaza supposed both had been the case. Doing some calculations in his head, he deemed that she probably hadn't slept once she'd ran away, and after all that happened afterwards, He didn't scold her for resting her eyes. In fact, a small part of him was revealed, in a sense. He kept telling himself it was simply because he needed her to be in top form, and she damn well wasn't about to sleep, well, standing, but she needed it. Her head was pressed against his vest, the rhythm of her breathing matching the pace of his now slowed walking. A part of him felt anxious, especially due to the fact the sun was really close to coming up. He wanted to run, but he knew it would wake in. Gritting his teeth, he walked as fast as he could without startling her. However, in the end, it proved pretty much pointless, because as the city came into view, along with its lights and music and the crowds of people, it was enough to wake her fully once more. Akaza glanced away from the sky and downwards, noticing her body shifting as she began to wake. Yin didn't say anything right away, but he recognized the half-asleep dazed look in her eyes as she rubbed them, awakening herself to observe her surroundings. That was one thing he always had a strong sense of pride towards her for. Her instincts were always at peak form, even while she was sleeping. Most of the time, that is. "We're here," she mumbled quietly, Akaza almost having missed it, though he seemed supposed it didn't matter anyways. It was more of a statement to herself than him directly. Nonetheless, he huffed, nodding, although the young assassin for once didn't have her eyes glued to him to be able to see it. Instead, she hadn't even been looking at him, her vision going to upcoming town ahead. Now fully awake, her eyes almost seemed to widen at the large expanse of it, flashing begun everywhere and everything that came into view. Had she never seen a place like this before? It was an odd question. The demon wasn't entirely sure why it came to mind. Shaking his head and dismissing the thought, he slowed his walking down once they reached the forest's edge, stopping by one of the forests that surround the city. "I'm going to have to leave you here for a moment, all right?" Her eyes finally tore away from the life-filled city, still dazed from earlier sleep, from her place itself. "Huh?" Her cluelessness made him hold back a laugh. "I said I'm leaving you here for a bit." And she frowned. "Where? In the city? What about you? And for how long?" Akaza grimaced at all her questions, cursing himself slightly for not giving her enough information in the first place. "I have to inspect the area, as well as find a place we're going to be staying for now." Her confusion, and somewhat fear, left her gaze. Why had she even been scared before? "So, we're staying here, right?" She raised a brow and peered down at him. "In the city, of course." Yin let out a breath, smiling slightly. "Okay, you can put me down now." And the young assassin said, perking up slightly. Akaza obeyed, making sure she would hold her own before he completely let go. Once he did, however, she was slumped down against a tree, her legs brought up to her chest as her arms around them. Her cheek rested atop one of her knees, eyes closing slightly. Akaza only stared at her, watching as she made herself comfortable against the tree. She really must be exhausted. "Are you sure I can't come with you yet?" she asked, snapping him out of his odd stare. He only nodded immediately. I'll only be gone quickly. Some of the scouting I do isn't impossible to accomplish while you're there." She scrunched her face into a frown, eyes closing even further. "Fine. I'm too tired to argue back anyways." She yawned. "Just hurry up so I can rest, okay, demon?" He grinned, a spark of what felt like pride bursting into his chest slightly. Pride for what? He wasn't entirely sure. There was still so many questions for both of them, and Akaza hoped they would be answered soon as he left the tree she was perched against, careful to warn her about anything he could think of in a quick manner. She was half asleep, but nodded anyways, tossing her hand carelessly to tell him, once again, to hurry the hell up. Akaza came faster than I expected, though even after all of his warnings for such a short departure from me, I still found myself dozing off, the effects of night finally taking its toll on me. I was exhausted, more than one ways, and with Akaza gone, it was hard to care whether I was conscious or not. But I still at least tried to keep myself aware, observing my surroundings and whatever considered of the newfound city. It was the same city in which I've been to before. This place I'd been in the latest mission all those weeks ago, though my mind was lacking the memory of its name. But honestly, at first glance, the contents of its name was the least of my concerns, because as soon as it all came into view again, the side of me I always learned to push away. It surfaced, and expected some way to at least last time, and my wondrous mind couldn't help but take it all in, even whilst Akaza had been talking to me. It was hard to listen. I'd forgotten how beautiful it was, how life was beautiful. The aura it gave off, I wasn't sure whether I was able to take my eyes off it. I wasn't sure what I wanted. Seated on the outskirts, the forest edge held such blankness compared to what was in front of me now. Once the demon had left me, the fact became even more clear to me, and even my sleep-idled mind figured that it was quite fitting to be able to observe such beauty and life in one area, to only be able to watch as people lived with such ecstasy, while I sat alongside the edge, unable to join them in such a world. Each and every time I came across such a place of wonder, I could never escape those thoughts. Twinkling lights that reminded me of such a warmth I always knew I was lacking. The soft sound yet joyful music reminding me of my sister. She, she would be able to cross into such a place. I could see her now, waving at my closed-in form against the tree whilst she walked away, leaving me alone. But I'd have been happy, for that were the case. If she had to find such joy and safety in my work, my one and only goal would be complete, and so I wouldn't mind being left here. I was used to the darkness now anyways, and one might find that when spending so alone, living in the dark would begin to live within you. Staring at the lifelessness, a knotted build-up of emotions began to form in my stomach, because even though I knew I was never meant to be part of it, my life was never destined for such joy. I still found myself wanting Akaza to come back to me, to bring me out of this solid reminder of what life could have been. I attempted to tear my gaze away, scowling the built-up lump in my throat, turning to face the other way, back into the night-filled forest, still so dark, even with the rising sun on its way. Yin. A voice sounded, alerting me of Akaza's return. I hadn't even heard him, but it was something I'd undoubtedly grown used to when it came to him. I slowly looked towards up him, the tattooed demon crossing his arms whilst tilting his head. I had the relief that snorted at his familiar form, and I smiled softly, closing my eyes once more. His voice sounded closer now, and I opened my eyes to find him crouched in front of me, an odd look upon his face as he beheld me. "Are you all right?" he questioned, genuine curiosity evident in his face. I didn't answer him right away, and he awaited my response quite patiently. "That's a good question," I said, scratching slightly before standing up. He backed up a few steps, helping me up with a surprising gentleness. His touch lingered, and I met his gaze, our faces not too far from one another. So many questions. I knew we could both see it in our other's gaze. Each seemed just as confused as we were, as though we both didn't know what exactly we were doing. "Akaza," I said, not breathing his stare. He cocked his head in question, slightly telling me to continue. I opened my mouth to speak, but held back the words I wasn't even sure of saying to him. Never mind. I look away. "Did the inspection go okay?" I asked instead, and his eyes flickered in hesitation before answering, almost as though he wished to pry and discover what I really wanted to say, but he must have decided against it, for a smile etched his lips. "It did indeed," he said, eyes lighting up before turning upwards toward the sky. "But we must hurry." I nodded, walking closer to him with a deep breath, preparing myself to be carried once more. He lifted a brow towards my actions, though, straightening his posture. "No arguing about walking this time?" I scoffed, and he smiled, scooping me into his arms in one swift movement. "Well, I've learned that you undoubtedly more knowledgeable about such antics, so it would only prove to be a waste. I say," and before he could say anything back once he continued his way into the city, I spoke again, finding myself needing to add one more thing. "Plus, I trust you." Not looking at him as I said so, I felt his eyes staring into me, his gazing burning. I wasn't sure how he would take such information, but it was true. What I had said. I trusted him, and I suppose that I had since the beginning, though it might prove to be a stupid decision on my part in the future. As of now, Akaza had done more for me than anything else ever had, and I'd just been blind to see it. So he carried me, my eyes unable to keep away from the beautiful scenery surrounding us, and lightening my artistic mind, I made a decision that I would change, that I would do better, and maybe I could fight for myself for once as well, to learn what it felt like to have such pride, the same sense of pride Akaza had for his own strength. After all, he simply hated weak humans, and he said so himself, that I had potential. Tearing my eyes away from my surroundings once more, I began to look up at him, his golden eyes leaning the way somehow. He said that he wouldn't have wasted his time on me if I wasn't worth it. He said that I had potential to be strong as him. He'd come to save me without any further considerations as to what might have happened to us. And I suppose that maybe it meant that Akaza, in a way, believed in me himself, and although my sister had as well, she never knew, or at least fully, who I really was along with what I did. But Akaza, he knew how I was. He saw the part of me that I always had to keep myself hidden from most, and for the first time in my life, I was commended for such strength, instead of being humiliated by it. It was such an odd realization, but it bloomed something inside my chest, something I hadn't felt in such a long time. And being held in his arms as we snuck through the crowds of people, I began to identify that feeling as hope. Yes, hope.